Up though, Tony and Bill decided they wanted to keep playing together, so they set out to find some others to form a new group. Then, as luck would have it at this point, they saw an ad about a singer named Ozzy looking for a gig. Upon seeing this, Tony would tell Bill, quote, "I know an Ozzy, it can't be that one." Yet when he went to the address listed in the ad, Tony was stunned to find that it was indeed the Ozzy that he knew. Iommi then wanted no part of this, telling Ward to just forget it. Bill, though, wanted to at least chat and get to know this Ozzy a little bit before completely dismissing him. Ward then seemed willing to give this Ozzy a chance after talking with him, but Tony continued to be reluctant, telling the drummer, quote, "No way, I know him." Yet within 3 weeks' time, they would all be in a band together with fellow future member of Black Sabbath Terry Butler, better known today as Geezer, who had come along with Ozzy. Geezer, you see, had also first really met Ozzy when he too had seen an ad in the local music shop reading "vocalists looking for a band." Then, similarly upon arriving at the address, he was met by a young man who he had seen in the past, heading home at 6 a.m. on Sunday mornings after spending the previous night at a local music club. You see, according to Geezer, Birmingham had two clubs back in their youth, a soul club that Ozzy used to go to, and a blues club that Geezer similarly spent his Saturday nights at. Then, since neither young man had money for bus fare, they would end up passing each other as they walked home the following morning. However, since according to Geezer, quote, "he was a skinhead and I was a hippie, we never really talked." Despite this, the two had joined forces with some other local musicians to form a group called the Rare Breed, but both Geezer and Ozzy would decide to leave that band behind as it clearly wasn't happening. It was then at this point that Ozzy posted the ad that got Tony and Bill's attention. So the four then came together to form what they called the Polka Tulk Blues Band, which was either named after a cheap brand of talcum powder used by Ozzy's mother or a local rug merchant. Now, the Polka Tulk Blues Band was more than just Ozzy, Geezer, Bill, and Tony, as they were also joined by Iommi's pal Alan Clark on saxophone and Osborne's friend Jimmy Phillips on bottleneck slide guitar. This wasn't exactly ideal because at the time Geezer was a guitarist, but with Tony and Jimmy on board he agreed to switch to bass. Although for a while there, until he could actually get a bass, Butler had to play the bass parts on a Telecaster guitar. The Polka Tulk Blues Band then looked to follow in the footsteps of bands like Cream and the Yardbirds, as they jammed and played a kind of heavy style blues through the newer, more powerful amplifiers of the day, using the volume and distortion of these amplifiers to kind of change the nature of these blues classics. Now, things were far from perfect with this new band. For example, according to Geezer, it took Ozzy a while to get comfortable on stage. This, though, he would chalk up mainly due to Ozzy's insecurities and lack of confidence due to his upbringing and the way his parents were very down on him. Now, while Ozzy would eventually find his feet, the other problems with the group were a little harder to resolve. The six-piece band was just a bit too much, as it often evolved into a mess with everyone trying to fit solos into every song. Yet, while the core group agreed that they really didn't need a sax player or a slide guitarist, none of them were really comfortable telling these two guys that they were out. So instead they announced the band was breaking up. Then, 2 weeks after the breakup, Tony, Ozzy, Bill, and Geezer would reunite to form a new band called Earth, which was still primarily a blues band. Still, I like to think there is some alternative universe that has to thank the Polka Tulk Blues Band for starting heavy metal. Yet while all involved seemed dedicated to this new group, Tony Iommi would get what might have seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime when he was invited to audition with Jethro Tull. You see, as discussed in my episode on their album Aqualung, following guitarist Mick Abrams' departure from Tull, Iommi was invited to come and try out. This was a significant opportunity, but Iommi was conflicted, in part because he really didn't want to join an already successful band to just be their guitar player. He wanted to be part of a team and have more of an influence on the band's sound/direction. The other members of Earth, though, encouraged him to go. Yet even then, Tony felt uncomfortable just going to London by himself, so he brought Geezer along with him. Iommi would then play with Tull for a time, and even appear in the film The Rolling Stones' Rock and Roll Circus that wouldn't actually be released until 1996. During that time, though, Iommi never really felt comfortable. It was an important experience, however, as it gave both Tony and Geezer an up-close look at how a successful professional band functioned. For a group of guys who were used to just going to a pub and rehearsing for an hour before getting drunk, getting to see Jethro Tull treat this as an actual job by getting together at 9 in the morning and working till 5 was a revelation. Tony then told Geezer that he wanted to get their band back together, at which point Iommi called up Ozzy and Bill to let them know if they were ready to really get serious, he was going to leave Tull and come back to Birmingham to try and make something out of their band. Which he did, but as he knew Four Piece was starting to hit their stride, they encountered a problem in August of 1969 when they learned they weren't the only band using the moniker Earth. You see, upon arriving at one gig, they were met by a man at the front door of the place wearing a bow tie and a suit. This, suffice it to say, was highly unusual. They had never been met by such a fancy individual before, and things got even odder when this man told them he really liked their new record. The band thanked him for the compliment, even though they were quite confused, seeing as how they hadn't made a record yet. By the end of the night, though, it was quite clear what had happened. The well-dressed man, it turned out, had booked the wrong Earth. Indeed, this became quite apparent when they took the stage and started playing, and no one there was into it. You see, the audience, much like the man who booked the show, had come expecting to see the other Earth, which was apparently a pop band, not this kind of heavy, ominous blues band standing in front of them. After this debacle, the band knew they had to change their name, as they never wanted to be in that situation again. Now, according to at least one version of the story, across the street from where this case of mistaken identity had taken place was a theater that just happened to be playing the 1963 Boris Karloff horror film Black Sabbath. Alternatively, it's been said that bassist Geezer Butler suggested the name, having heard about and been intrigued by the movie when he was younger. Stories that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Regardless, the band really liked the name as it sounded spooky, which was good, as they had come to the conclusion that if people paid money to feel scared at the movies, then the same must be true of concerts. Indeed, with this in mind, the original music they had been writing was starting to reflect their own fascination with the dark side. This was especially the case when Geezer Butler, prior to these events, had come to the band with an idea for a song. An idea that was inspired by a disturbing vision he had one night. Geezer, you see, was a fan of horror films and the black magic-themed novels of Dennis Wheatley, and for a time he even briefly dabbled in the black arts. But when he saw what he believed to be a figure from the dark side at the foot of his bed one night, Geezer decided to put a stop to those pursuits. Inspired by the story, Ozzy began writing lyrics, as the band composed a song about the visitation that would come to share the name they had given their band Black Sabbath. From there, it didn't take long for the members of the band to realize they had something with this song. Indeed, the first time they played it live was at a pub called the Pokey Hole in the Midlands. Now, this was the type of gig where even as the band was playing, the people at the bar would just keep drinking and talking as if they weren't even there. This time, though, as they launched into their new song, reportedly everyone just kind of stopped what they were doing and listened. This song was clearly something different from the normal fare, and people took notice. Yet, despite finding something unique that caught people's attention, the band would still be rejected by multiple managers. Still, the band pressed on, touring constantly as they followed somewhat in the footsteps of their predecessors like the Beatles as they played the European club circuit. In fact, Black Sabbath would actually break the Beatles' residency record at the Star Club in Hamburg. Since the group was playing for 6 days a week for like 8 hours a day, they got incredibly tight musically. They also really perfected the songs they had written for their first album. Plus, since they were playing for so long to fill up the extra space, they used the opportunity to work on new songs, to the point that they had most of their second album written before the first even came out. Speaking of their debut album, in November 1969, with a budget of £600, Black Sabbath would enter the studio to record their self-titled first album in a single 12-hour session. Obviously, this wasn't some top-shelf type studio, and nor obviously did they have time to record each of their parts separately. Instead, the band set up their gear in the small studio and basically recorded live, which worked for them as they were a really tight live band by this point. Still, this was quite a rushed process, as they only had a chance to attempt a couple of songs more than once. As for overdubs and alike, Tony actually got the chance to do a few with his guitar, but when Ozzy asked if he could do some additional vocal tracks, they were told their time was up and to get out of the studio. In fact, this rushed schedule would help to further define Sabbath's signature sound, as up till this point, Iommi was playing a white Fender Strat. When they got into the studio, though, he found out that one of the pickups on the guitar was malfunctioning. So, with no time to figure out what was wrong, much less fix it, Tony had to switch gears and use the Gibson SG he'd only recently purchased as a backup. A fateful decision, as the guitar would become the one most identified with him and the band. When they were done, what many believed to be the first true heavy metal record had been created. This was in no small part due to the guitar work of Tony Iommi. While many guitarists had explored power chords and distortion during the 60s, Iommi was the first to really make these the defining aspect of his tone, really leaning into the distortion in ways others hadn't. Combine that with Geezer Butler often doubling his guitar parts on bass, giving them even more power and a deeper quality, Bill Ward's powerful drumming, and Ozzy's haunting vocals, the blueprint of heavy metal had been created. For me, it's clear that heavy metal descended from the blues, which is something many heavy metal fans may find surprising. At first listen, you may not hear the connection between a modern metal band and an old blues recording. One is fast, heavy, and distorted, and in some cases very complex in terms of structure, technique, or time signatures, where blues may seem very basic, old school, and simple by comparison. But it is no coincidence that early proto-metal influences like Hendrix, Cream, and Zeppelin were all heavily blues-based. Sabbath would even be compared to Cream unfavorably in the Rolling Stones review of their first album because they, like Cream, were rooted in the blues. They were just playing it through the kind of equipment that wasn't available to the old-school bluesmen. Now, one of the main connections between the two musical styles is the guitar riff. A riff is, and this is one of those concepts that I just know and understand, but putting it into exact words is a little difficult, but I guess you can best describe it as a musical phrase or chord progression that you repeat over and over again. These riffs then become the backbone of the song. Basically, each of the little musical breaks I use to structure this podcast are a riff of one kind or another. Metal then is built off of riffs. Depending on the band, you could hammer away at a couple riffs for the whole song, or you could have like a dozen riffs in a single piece. The blues, meanwhile, is also notably known for its simple riffs. In the end, then, basically the thing that is separating the two styles is how you play the riffs. Blues, I would say, then tends to generally be slower and more laid back, where in metal there's more of a force or aggression behind it. Also consider that one of the criteria I described as being a part of metal music was a tendency for dark and sometimes even supernatural lyrical subject matter. This is not unique to metal though, and is something you'd find in more than a few old blues songs. Yeah, metal has had a long fascination with the devil, but the bluesmen did it first. Much like metal, the devil was a figure in the blues basically from its birth as well. Robert Johnson famously told the tale of how he had sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads to learn how to play the guitar. This would appear in his songs Crossroad Blues and Hellhound on My Trail. Meanwhile, Delta bluesman Skip James would perform Devil Got My Woman, a song which made the devil a figure in a love song long before Sabbath's N.I.B. And you don't have to take my word for it. Tony Iommi, for example, said, quote, "In the beginning, I was primarily influenced by old blues records. And like I stated earlier, when they came together and were still calling themselves Earth, they started out playing the blues, before turning their attention to writing their own material. Speaking about this time, Geezer Butler has said, quote, "Everybody else was doing soul and pop music, and we started doing more bluesy stuff." And Iommi would say of the period, quote, "We were playing old-style blues, really. When we started Earth, it wasn't true Chuck Berry stuff. It was more of the old American blues." So what sparked them to change from being a blues band to creating what we now consider to be heavy metal? According to Iommi again, quote, "Well, to be honest, we just became so fed up with people talking while we were playing that we said, screw it, let's turn it up so they won't be able to chatter." And I totally get that. I once, years back, got tickets to go see B.B. King, so I figured why not? I get the chance to go see a legend in person, I might as well go do it. But when he got started, no one in the room would shut up. They just kept talking. You could barely even hear the man play. So I ended up leaving disappointed not because of King, but because of the audience and their disrespect. So yeah, I totally get the reaction of, oh, you want to keep talking? I'll just keep playing louder and louder until you stop. Even Ozzy Osbourne in his autobiography would say that they never set out to play heavy metal. They only wanted to play a darker form of the blues. They had no idea at the time the impact they would have. That being said, as much as an influence as the blues was on Black Sabbath and the birth of heavy metal, the environment they grew up in was just as important. You see, much like the blues, heavy metal started out as the music of the lower class. Now, clearly, they never had things quite as bad as African American bluesmen living in the US, but all four original members of Black Sabbath hailed from Birmingham, England, which was an industrial suburb of London. The city, from their childhood through at least the mid to late 60s, continued to bear the scars of the Birmingham Blitz, the intense Nazi air raids that tried to cripple England's manufacturing ability. So, while the city's center